The Black Mustang was agonizing among the volcanic rocks for hours. Richard sped up the Porsche. Animal problems didn't pay his bills, but when he recognized the rock formations in the background, his blood ran cold. No one imagined what would come next. Subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Do you believe in second chances, or are some things just irreversible? Let's dive into the story now. Richard Thornton signed contracts as if signing death warrants. At 62, he had transformed ancient forests into shopping malls, evicted entire families from ancestral lands, and demolished historical landmarks without losing a wink of sleep. That Tuesday morning, his newest victim waited across the table. Margaret Miller, 67, a widow desperately trying to save her family ranch. "Mr. Thornton, please," her voice trembled. "4 generations have lived on our land. My grandchildren were born there." Richard didn't even look up from the documents. His fingers drummed on the imported mahogany as he calculated the millions those lands would yield as a luxury development. "Sentiments don't pay overdue mortgages, Ms. Miller. Sign or you'll be evicted tomorrow." "But you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." He finally looked at her, his gray eyes cold as steel. "I understand you had 23 months to settle the debt. I understand you refused 3 previous offers, and I understand you're wasting my time." Margaret Miller left the room in tears, carrying only the certainty that she would lose everything. Richard filed the signed documents, satisfied. Another $12 million in net profit. In his life philosophy, compassion was synonymous with bankruptcy. Kindness was a weakness too expensive to afford. At 62, he possessed a fortune of $800 million and a heart worth less than the change in his pocket. The flight to Yellowstone was just business. The Grandview Mountain Resort would be his masterpiece, 1,235 acres of wilderness transformed into an artificial paradise for millionaires. Senators had already been bought off, environmental permits forged, local communities silenced with money or threats. All that remained was his final signature on site. The rented Porsche 911 cut through the park road like a black blade. Richard detested nature. He preferred concrete, steel, predictable profit, but he needed to personally see where the helipad and golf courses would be built. Every tree felled represented more dollars in the bank. That's when he saw the desperate whinnies. The Black Mustang was trapped between 2 enormous volcanic rocks, its right hind leg wedged in a narrow crevice. The wild animal had been struggling for hours, its sweaty coat gleaming under the midday sun. Blood ran from its injured leg, staining the gray stone. A crescent moon-shaped scar marked its forehead, the result of ancient territorial battles. Richard instinctively slammed on the brakes, then cursed his own reaction. He checked his Rolex, late for the most important meeting of the year. The horse could die there. It wasn't his problem. Wild animals died every day. It was the law of nature, pure and simple. He shifted into first gear to accelerate, but something stopped him. It wasn't pity. Richard had killed that feeling decades ago. It was something more disturbing. The volcanic rocks, the arrangement of the mountains in the background, even the angle of the light filtered through the treetops. All of it felt familiar in a way that made his stomach churn. The Mustang stared at him with wild, intelligent eyes, as if it knew its life depended on that decision. Richard turned off the engine, annoyed with himself. He would save the animal not out of compassion, but because a wild horse was worth at least $50,000 on the black market. There was always a practical reason for everything. Richard ripped off his Armani jacket and rolled up his shirt sleeves. The Mustang tensed even more as he approached, its muscles taut as steel cables. It had never been touched by human hands. It was a pure, wild animal, born free in the mountains of Yellowstone. "Calm down, you idiot," Richard muttered, assessing the situation. The hind leg was stuck in a vertical fissure between 2 enormous basalt rocks. The animal had tried to jump, miscalculated the distance, and was now paying the price. Clotted blood clung to the hairs on its hock. "This is going to hurt you a lot more than it hurts me." It took 40 minutes of brutal work to widen the crevice with smaller stones. With each movement, the Mustang thrashed in panic, almost trampling Richard twice. His $1,000 Swiss shirt tore at the elbow. Rock shards cut his hands, staining his gold cufflinks with blood. When he finally freed the leg, the horse collapsed onto its side, too exhausted to flee. Richard backed away, panting, evaluating the injuries. Deep cuts, a possible fracture, almost certain infection. $50,000, he repeated to himself, justifying the idiotic decision to get involved. Back in the Porsche, he dialed the nearest veterinarian. "Dr. Martinez, Richard Thornton, I need you in Yellowstone North Trail, mile marker 47, now." The voice on the other end hesitated. Everyone knew Thornton's reputation. "Bring heavy sedatives and antibiotics, and a van." 2 hours later, Dr. Martinez confirmed the obvious. Wild Mustang, male, approximately 8 years old, never domesticated. "He'll need intensive care for at least 6 weeks, he said, stitching the injured leg. "There's a rehabilitation center in Jackson Hole, but the waiting list." How much to jump the line? It's not a matter of money. They're at capacity. An animal of this size, with severe injuries. Martinez shook his head. "Honestly, euthanasia would be more humane." Richard stared at the sedated horse in the improvised van. The animal breathed heavily, the lunar scar on its forehead contracting with each breath. "Take him to my hotel. I'll take care of this personally." It was the first decision in decades that didn't make financial sense. Back at his temporary office in Jackson, Richard cancelled the 235-acre meeting, claiming a medical emergency. His partners were furious, postponed the project because of a horse. But there was something about that Mustang, in the place where he found it, that stirred Richard in an inexplicable way. That night, in the improvised stable behind the hotel, he watched the animal sleep. He had named it Thunder, not out of sentimentality, but because the sound of its hooves on the rock reminded him of distant thunder. The wild horse awakened fragmented memories in him, buried sensations he had preferred to forget, especially the feeling of having been in those mountains before, not as a tourist, not as a businessman, as something different, someone different. Dr. Martinez returned the next day with mixed news. The leg will heal, but he'll never be completely wild again. Depending on the care, he could live another 15 years. Of course, that means what? It means you now have a horse, Mr. Thornton. When the veterinarian mentioned where the animal had been born, the Thunder Basin region near the old mining lands, something clicked in Richard's mind. Thunder Basin, where everything had begun and ended. Richard drove to Thunder Basin the next day, alone. The name hammered in his head ever since Dr. Martinez mentioned it. The GPS coordinates led him down dirt roads he knew even after 30 years without seeing them. The landscape hadn't changed. Pine-covered mountains, deep valleys cut by crystal-clear streams, and everywhere the signs of a mining operation abandoned decades ago. When he reached the top of the central hill, Richard parked and got out of the car with trembling legs. There was the sign he didn't want to see. Thornton and Sons Mining, established 1952. The wood was rotten, the letters faded, but still legible. On the other side of the sign, a trail led to the wreckage of what was once the main cabin. His childhood home. Richard walked through the devastated land like a ghost, revisiting his own grave. There, where wildflowers now grew among metal debris, was the kitchen where his father, Thomas Thornton, prepared coffee before his 5 a.m. shift. Further on, the remains of a corral where dozens of wild mustangs came to drink water every day. Animals his father fiercely protected against hunters and speculators. "These horses are our responsibility, Richard," Thomas's voice echoed through the years. "This land sustains us, so we protect it. That's how real men live." But Richard didn't want to be a real man. He wanted to be rich. In the abandoned library of Jackson Hole, Richard scoured county records until he found what he was looking for, records of Thomas Thornton's last 5 years of life. What he discovered was like a punch to the gut. After Richard left for college at 18, cutting contact due to irreconcilable differences, Thomas continued protecting the Mustangs of Thunder Basin, alone. He spent his meager pension buying hay for harsh winters, veterinary medicines for injured animals, and fighting in court against companies that wanted to turn the region into a hunting ground. Even more painful, Thomas had tried to reconnect with his son. Dozens of letters sent to Richard's addresses, all returned unopened. Blocked calls, rejected birthday gifts. The last entry in Thomas's personal diary, written 3 weeks before he died of a massive heart attack at 67, tore Richard apart. Richard turns 32 today. I still feed the Mustangs he loved as a child. That way, when he comes back, he'll know I never gave up on him. Horses have long memories. So do I. Richard never came back, not even for the funeral. Leaving the library, he found Martha Williams, an old family neighbor. At 75, she remembered everything with painful clarity. Your father died with your name on his lips, Martha said bluntly. He died believing you would come home one day. He died protecting those wild horses because he said they were the only connection left between you. He never really looked for me, Richard lied, but his voice came out weak. He looked every single day for 15 years. You chose not to see. Martha adjusted her purse on her shoulder, ready to leave. Thomas left everything to you in his will, you know? The land, the house, even a sealed letter. It's all at the county clerk's office, waiting for 12 years. That night, Richard sat on the hotel balcony with a bottle of whiskey and cried for the first time in 3 decades. Thunder rested in the nearby stable, his bandaged leg slowly healing. Outside, other wild Mustangs grazed freely on the hills, direct descendants of the animals Thomas protected until his last day. Richard wasn't just crying for an injured horse. He was crying for the man he could have been. At the Jackson Hole County Clerk's office, Richard signed the inheritance transfer papers with trembling hands. After 12 years in legal limbo, Thunder Basin officially belonged to him. 494 acres of devastated land worth less than his car. And a sealed letter with his name in Thomas's familiar handwriting. He opened it in the parking lot, alone. My son, if you are reading this, it means you have finally come home. No matter how much time has passed, no matter what happened between us, you are my blood, and blood always finds its way back. I leave this land to you not as an inheritance, but as a responsibility. Protect the Mustangs as I protected them. They are free as you should be, with all the love a father can feel, Thomas. Attached to the letter were photos, an elderly Thomas feeding wild horses in the snow, mending fences to protect water sources, even sleeping out in the open to watch over a mare in labor. In each photo, he smiled, something Richard didn't remember seeing in the last years they lived together. Back at the hotel, Richard found Dr. Martinez examining Thunder. His recovery is going well, but we have a problem, the veterinarian said. Your partners called 3 times today. They said if you don't return to close the resort deal by Friday, they'll replace you as majority partner. The Grandview Mountain contract was worth $50 million in personal commissions for Richard. $50 million that vanished when he looked at Thunder and thought of Thomas protecting that horse's ancestors with his own life. Dr. Martinez, Richard said slowly, what would it take to turn Thunder Basin into an official wild Mustang sanctuary? The veterinarian blinked, confused. A sanctuary? Well, it would require restoring water sources, building winter shelters, hiring specialized vets. We're talking at least $2 million in initial investment. That night, Richard called his partners in New York. I'm out of the Grandview project, he announced without preamble. Have you lost your mind, Thornton? Peterson's voice was hysterical on the other end of the line. That's 500 million in development. Your share alone. My mind's made up. Richard hung up. Within 15 minutes, his phone blew up. Furious partners, lawyers threatening lawsuits, investors demanding explanations. Richard turned off the device and threw it in a drawer. The next morning, Thunder had a crisis. The infection had spread. His fever spiked to dangerous levels. Richard spent the entire night in the stable, applying cold compresses, forcing antibiotics, whispering words he never imagined saying to an animal. "You're not going to die," he repeated, more to himself than to Thunder. "I won't let anyone else die alone." At 6 in the morning, the fever broke. Thunder opened his eyes and, for the first time since the rescue, accepted food from Richard's hand. It wasn't domestication, it was trust earned through genuine care. Richard picked up the phone and made the most difficult call of his life, to Margaret Miller, the widow he had evicted the previous week. "Ms. Miller, Richard Thornton, I want to give you back your land." Silence on the other end. No strings attached, no interest, no quid pro quo, just "forgive me." Margaret Miller cried on the phone, not from relief, from shock. In 30 years of dealing with businessmen, she had never seen anyone return what had already been legally acquired. Richard wasn't doing it for the horse. He was doing it for the memory of the man he had disappointed. He was doing it because he finally understood the difference between having money and having worth. He was doing it because he wanted to honor the Thornton name for the first time in 3 decades. 6 months later, Richard had lost 90% of his businesses and never felt richer. He sold the penthouse in Manhattan, the imported cars, the yacht docked in Miami. Every cent was reinvested in Thunder Basin and in restitution for people he had harmed over the years. The list was long and painful. To Maria Evans, a family evicted for a shopping mall construction, a new home and funds for their children's education. To the retirees of Springwood Retirement Community, defrauded with substandard apartments, complete renovations and compensation. To 12 rural communities devastated by his ventures, fully funded sustainable reconstruction projects. Thunder had fully recovered, but chose to stay. He wasn't confined, the property had no tall fences, and he could leave whenever he wanted. But every morning, the black Mustang appeared near the new cabin Richard built on the exact spot of his father's home, as if he understood that place needed protection. "It's strange," Dr. Martinez commented during a routine visit. "Wild horses don't form bonds with humans like this, but Thunder seems to understand that you're not a threat." Richard watched the horse graze freely among 15 other Mustangs that had naturally migrated to the sanctuary. "It's not me he protects, it's this place." The transformation didn't go unnoticed. Former employees reported that Richard had become unrecognizable. He kept promises, paid fair wages, treated employees by name. Where once there was cold calculation, now there was human consideration. But not everyone forgave him. Marcus Henderson, a former partner who lost $2 million when Richard abandoned a joint project, appeared at Thunder Basin one autumn afternoon. He came armed with a lawsuit and accumulated rage. "You owe me an explanation, Thornton," he said, stepping out of a black BMW. "And $2 million. Richard was fixing a horse trough, his hands dirty with mud and grease. "You're right, on both counts." Henderson blinked, disarmed by the agreement. What? "I owe you $2 million and an explanation." Richard put down his tools, wiping himself on an old towel. "The explanation is simple. I was a scoundrel who put profit above everything. The $2 million, it's going to take time for me to get it." "Time?" Henderson was confused. "You're a multi-millionaire." "I was. Now I'm a wild horse caretaker." Richard pointed to Thunder, who watched them from afar with alert eyes. I spent everything correcting mistakes I didn't even remember making. Henderson looked around. The modest property, the free animals, Richard in simple clothes and calloused hands. Have you lost your mind? Perhaps. Or perhaps I've become sane for the first time in my life. Richard extended his hand. I'll pay you, Marcus, but it will be in installments, over years, and if you don't accept, you'll have to sue me. Henderson looked at the outstretched hand for long seconds. Then he shook it, still incredulous. My lawyers are going to have a nervous breakdown. Mine, too. That night, Richard dined alone on the cabin porch, watching Thunder and the other Mustangs prepare for the night. For the first time in decades, he wasn't calculating losses or profits. He simply existed in that moment, in that place his father protected until he died. The phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. Hello, Dad. The voice on the other end made him drop his fork. Dad, it's me, Rebecca, his daughter, who hadn't spoken to him in 8 years. 2 years passed since Richard found Thunder trapped among the rocks. Now, at 64, he woke up every day at 5 in the morning to check on the horses, something Thomas had done 3 decades earlier. The sanctuary permanently housed 40 wild Mustangs and received hundreds of visitors a month interested in conservation. Thunder, now estimated to be 10 years old, had become the informal patriarch of the herd. His lunar scar had become more pronounced with age, but he was still strong, vigorous, a natural leader among the wild ones. Richard often found him at the top of the hill at dusk, contemplating the mountains like a sentinel. Rebecca had visited 3 times since the first call. The encounters were tense, careful. Decade-old wounds don't heal quickly. But she brought the grandchildren, and Richard saw in the children's eyes the same fascination with wild horses he had felt in his childhood. You really have changed, Rebecca said during her last visit, watching her father feed an orphan foal with a bottle. I remember when you said feelings were for the weak. I was wrong about a lot of things, Richard replied, not taking his eyes off the foal, especially about what it means to be strong. Dr. Martinez, now the sanctuary's official veterinarian, brought worrying news. Thunder is aging faster than we expected. In the wild, Mustangs rarely live past 15. He has a good decade ahead, but he's in the second half of his life. Thunder's mortality reflected Richard's own reality. At 64, he knew he had perhaps 15 productive years left. The question was, what would he do with that time? The answer came when Tommy Chen, a 45-year-old businessman, appeared at the sanctuary interested in buying some land for tourism development. Richard recognized in him his own arrogance from years ago, the calculating gaze, the body language that said, everything has a price, the impatience with sentimentality. Look, Thornton, Chen said, flipping through documents, I know you got all into this nature talk, but let's talk real business. I can turn this place into an eco-resort, bring real money to the region. Richard took him to meet Thunder. The black Mustang approached without fear, allowed Richard to touch his lunar scar, a gesture that had become routine between them. This horse saved my life, Richard said simply. A horse? Chen laughed. Man, you've really lost it. Not the horse itself, what he represented. Richard caressed Thunder's neck. My father cared for his ancestors for 15 years alone, waiting for me to come home. When I finally returned, he was dead. But Thunder was still here, like a last chance to do the right thing. Chen looked around impatiently. That's very nice, but it doesn't pay the bills. You're right, Richard agreed. It doesn't pay the bills. It pays debts bigger than money. Chen left without closing a deal, grumbling about sentimental old fools. Richard watched him go, remembering himself 3 years ago. Some people needed their own horses trapped in rocks to learn what truly mattered. That night, Richard opened the last document Thomas had left, a map of the region with handwritten notes about Mustang migratory routes, water sources, natural shelters. In the bottom corner, a final note. To Richard, who never forgot these horses, even when he pretended he did. Thomas had always known his son would return. The question was whether Richard would honor that faith with the time he had left. On the 3rd anniversary of Thomas Thornton's death, Richard organized the first Thunder Basin Conservation Festival. Hundreds of people came, researchers, families, children fascinated by the wild horses. Rebecca brought the grandchildren, who ran freely across the property while Thunder watched them paternally from afar. Dr. Martinez presented impressive data. The Mustang population in the region had grown 40% since the sanctuary's creation. 3 foals were born that year, including a filly, a daughter of Thunder, who had inherited the lunar scar on her forehead. The legacy continued. Most notably, Martinez told the audience, we are documenting wild behaviors that were disappearing. These horses are teaching their foals to be truly free. During the festival, an elderly woman approached Richard. It was Martha Williams, now 78, leaning on a cane, but with still bright eyes. Thomas would be proud, she said, pointing to Thunder grazing peacefully among curious visitors. He always said you had his heart. You just needed to remember where you kept it. Took me 62 years to find it, Richard replied. Better late than never. In the afternoon, when the visitors left, Richard walked to the top of the hill where he had installed a simple plaque. Thomas Thornton Preserve, in memory of a man who protected what he loved. Thunder followed him, as he always did in moments of silence. Sitting on the grass, Richard watched the herd prepare for the night. 42 wild horses now, from newborn foals to veteran mares, all free, all protected, all carrying in their veins the blood of the animals Thomas fed during 15 solitary winters. You knew, didn't you? Richard said to Thunder, who grazed nearby. You knew I needed to come home. Thunder raised his head, his dark eyes reflecting the golden light of dusk. The lunar scar shone like a sacred mark, a permanent reminder that some wounds transform into symbols of resilience. Richard closed his eyes and finally heard Thomas's voice in the wind. This land sustains us, so we protect it. That's how real men live. At 64, Richard Thornton finally learned to live like a real man. When he opened his eyes, Thunder had lain down next to him, something wild horses rarely do near humans. The Black Patriarch rested peacefully, trusting the man who was once his savior and was now his partner in protecting those mountains. Richard was no longer trying to buy his father's forgiveness. He was honoring his memory in the only way that mattered, continuing the work. With every foal born free, with every family that visited the sanctuary and learned about conservation, with every day the Mustangs ran wild through Thunder Basin, the Thornton name regained its true meaning. Not as a symbol of accumulated wealth, but as the guardian of something priceless. In the first person, for the only time in the story, Richard whispered to the empty mountains, I can't go back and be the son I should have been, but I can be different today and tomorrow, and for the time I have left. Thomas believed in second chances. Thunder gave me mine. Now it's my turn to pay it forward. This story is about regret, about words we didn't say, calls we didn't make, people we left behind while chasing things that don't matter. If you have someone you love but are distant from due to pride, anger, or being too busy, don't wait to need a wild horse to teach you what truly matters. Call, write, show up. Because unlike Richard, you still have time. And if this story reminded you of someone, or if you believe in second chances, share it. We never know who needs to hear this today. Thanks for watching. See you in the next story.